On behalf of the New York City Bar Association, I'm honored to present this conversation with Professor Noam Chomsky. I'm Diane Fenner of the Senior Lawyers Committee, and my co-host is Suzanne Neinenberg of the Business and Human Rights Committee. This program will last 1 hour. Professor Chomsky will speak on the topic of the emerging world order, and then he will take audience questions. Please use the Q&A button on your screen to submit your questions. We're recording on April 13, 2023. When we finish talking, this video will be posted online. Anyone can see it free anytime on our public-facing website, nycbar.org, as well as on YouTube. Professor Noam Chomsky is Laureate Professor of Linguistics at the University of Arizona and Institute Professor Emeritus at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He's known as the father of modern linguistics. He's also a political activist and the author of more than 150 popular books. According to the Arts and Humanities Citation Index, Professor Chomsky was cited more often within a 20-year period than any other living scholar. Philosophically, Professor Chomsky is an anarchist in the tradition of Rudolf Rocker. He advocates radical changes to our government, but pragmatically, he is also a realist, and in the last presidential election, he argued in support of Joe Biden. Throughout his career, Chomsky has consistently been a lightning rod for public debate. The mass media blacklisted him as his popularity continued to grow. The foreign press called him a relentless thorn in America's side, a champion of the people, and simply one of the most influential leaders of a century. Welcome. And thank you for joining us, Professor Chomsky.
Pleased to be with you. It's no secret that the shape of world order is very much in flux. I'd like to return to that, but after a few general comments about how I think we should proceed to gain a clear understanding of these matters. So currently, there are two conflicting concepts about the proper form of world order. One is that it should be a UN-based global order. The other is that it should be a rules-based global order. These are fundamentally different conceptions. The UN-based order is to be founded on the UN Charter, other international treaties, broadly adopted agreements. The concept is fairly clear. The rule-based order is somewhat more obscure. Which rules? And who sets the rules? Well, in doctrine and in practice, rules are set by the dominant global power, the global hegemon. Since World War II, that's been the United States for most of the world. The UN-based order is supported by China, almost all the global South. The rules-based order is supported by the United States and its allies, and it's de rigueur in scholarship and commentary here to keep to this practice with rare and marginal exceptions. Actually, the US has strong reasons to oppose the UN-based order. Its basic principle is that the threat or use of force is barred in international affairs, except in special circumstances that rarely, if ever, arise. That provision of the Charter, Article 2.4, bars US foreign policy. There are many ways to violate the Charter. For example, by attacking a country with no credible pretext, by launching terrorist wars, by intervening to overthrow parliamentary governments, to impose harsh sanctions that devastate the population, or simply to declare that all options are open if some country does not accede to our demands. Explicit violation of Article 2.4, President Obama on Iran, to take one example. Well, it's an interesting exercise, never undertaken to my knowledge, to ask whether any post-war president has not violated the UN Charter. Actually, make a side comment here. I'm making an assumption, namely that words mean what they say. I'm well aware that there are learned articles in the American Journal of International Law, other scholarly literature, arguing that they don't. But for the purposes of this discussion, I'd like to keep to the assumption words mean what they say. Well, that assumption has some further consequences. According to the Constitution, as you all know, all treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land. Of course, includes the UN Charter, the main post-war international treaty. So still assuming that words mean what they say, we can ask whether any president has not violated the Constitution. Kind of interesting to think about, but I'll put it aside and turn to further considerations of the rules-based order. What are the rules? Well, one answer, which has broad consequences for world order, was given by Secretary of War Henry Stimson when the US was mobilizing to fight World War II, days I remember very well. In Stimson's words, if you're going to try to go to war or to prepare for war in a capitalist country, you have to let business make money out of the process, or business won't work. That principle was followed during the war. Wages were regulated. We planted victory gardens, curtailed driving, and in other ways joined the mobilization. Profits flowed. The Stimson principle, which is close to truism, has direct application today. We're now engaged in a war that is far vaster in scale and import even than World War II. The war to save organized human society from destruction by boiling the planet. It's a severe and imminent threat. Sure, you saw the IPCC report a couple of days ago, which underscores it with dramatic clarity. The Biden administration entered with fairly decent plans to address the threat. Not enough, but a considerable improvement on anything that preceded. They were whittled away by 100% Republican opposition, joined by few right-wing Democrats. What survived is the Inflation Reduction Act. It's basically a climate policy, not without value, but a pale shadow of what had been proposed. And it's based on the Stimson principle. We must bribe fossil fuel companies and the banks that fund them to be a little nicer. How? By increasing subsidies to them, offering them huge new fields to exploit for decades beyond the time when the climate is likely to pass irreversible tipping points. Well, too bad, but those are the rules. The rules extend to global architecture. Its basic design is the trade agreements established mainly in the Clinton years, World Trade Organization and NAFTA. They're called free trade agreements. That's farcical. They are investor rights agreements that offer enormous gifts to private power, including patent protections of utterly unprecedented scale and scope. That's why drug prices in the US are out of sight, to take one example. Well, these and similar rules are responsible for highway robbery on an extraordinary scale. The Rand Corporation estimates that in the 40 years since Reagan launched the neoliberal assault on the population, about $50 trillion have been transferred to the top 1% from workers and the middle class, the lower 90% on the income scale. That's pretty impressive class war, $50 trillion. There have been similar, even worse effects wherever the rules have been applied. In another dimension, these rules have naturally led to anger, resentment, contempt for institutions, fertile terrain for demagogues of the Trump variety who can hold up a banner with one hand saying, "I love you," while the other hand stabs you in the back. That's lucidly demonstrated by the legislative achievements of the last Republican and recent Republican administrations. Surely Trump, who had one legislative achievement, namely the huge tax cut for the rich in the corporate sector that Joseph Stiglitz called the Donor Relief Act of 2017. But as Stimson wisely said, those are the rules, at least in the unconstrained capitalist system of the kind that has prevailed since Reagan and Thatcher unleashed savage class war. Well, that's one dimension of world order. What about the domain of force? Subversion, terror, coercion in the international domain? Here, another side comment. We can, if we choose, dismiss the recent historical record. It's a good way of ensuring that we'll understand very little about what's taking place right now. Policies are based on institutions and cultural norms. These have barely changed in high places, so it makes good sense to suppose that what has guided policy in the past, recent past, will continue to prevail. Well, suppose we agree to be rational and look at the recent record and what lessons it teaches us about the future. Happens to be an auspicious moment to do so. This is a season of anniversaries. Right now, we've reached the 20th anniversary of the US invasion of Iraq, 50th anniversary of the agreement to end the war in Vietnam, and the 50th anniversary of the first 9/11. We learn a lot about the likely future by asking how these events are being commemorated by the most powerful country in history. Well, let's start with the first 9/11. If I mention that in the United States, or most of the West, few have any idea what I'm talking about. There was only one 9/11 in 2001 in New York. The fact that few know about the first 9/11 is of no little significance for today and for the future. First 9/11 was 9/11, 1973, the military coup that overthrew the flourishing democracy of Chile, stalling the murderous Pinochet dictatorship. By any measure, the first 9/11 was a far more extreme act of terrorism and violence than the one recognized in the West. It was, of course, terror, state terror. The United States was instrumental in implementing the Pinochet coup, rejoiced in its success, offered enormous diplomatic and material support to the dictatorship that was imposed. So let's turn to comparisons of the two 9/11s. The right way to compare their impact, of course, is in per capita terms. For our 9/11, that would mean 150,000 deaths, 1 million victims of torture. That's considering only raw numbers. There's far more than that. The second 9/11 did not overthrow the US government, kill the president, install a vicious dictatorship. The second 9/11 had no lasting effects in the United States. It did have major effects in the Central Asia, Middle East region, not very attractive ones, but that's a separate story. In contrast, the effects of the first 9/11 have been drastic. Chile is only now, 50 years later, struggling to overcome the effects of the destruction of Chile's vibrant social democracy. Still a hard struggle. That's worth contemplation. Well, let's turn to the 50th anniversary of the Vietnam Peace Agreement. 4 years later, 1977, President Carter was asked in a press conference whether the US owed some debt to Vietnam for the slaughter, ruin, wreckage, which still persists as children die from the massive US chemical warfare launched by John F. Kennedy in South Vietnam to destroy crops and livestock and drive the population into virtual concentration camps where they could be protected, as it was called, from the indigenous resistance that US intelligence knew they were supporting. Well, Carter responded to the question by saying, "We owe Vietnam no debt because the destruction was mutual." No need to comment. Recall that Carter was unique among US presidents in his concern for human rights. And in fact, after leaving office, he compiled an honorable record unmatched in presidential history, well beyond the United States, in fact. Well, Carter was far from alone. At the war's end in 1975, the most extreme opponents of the war in the US media wrote that the war began with, I'm quoting, blundering efforts to do good, but turned out to be a bad mistake because the US couldn't bring democracy to Vietnam at a cost acceptable to itself. Again, no comment necessary. Well, let's turn to the third anniversary, the 20th anniversary of the invasion of Iraq, worst crime of this century. There was actually an interview with the perpetrator, George W. Bush. It was in the Washington Post. In the style section, he was portrayed as a goofy grandpa playing happily with his grandchildren, showing off the portraits he had painted of famous people he had met. There were a few comments on this by his adoring fans, like Michelle Obama, who said, "I love him to death. He's a wonderful man. He's a funny man." Not everyone in Afghanistan and Iraq loves him to death, though they know a lot about death. The US government did, in fact, commemorate the 20th anniversary of the invasion of Iraq. One of the most horrendous atrocities of the invasion was the murderous attack on Fallujah, destroyed one of Iraq's most beautiful cities, unknown numbers of civilian deaths. That's a topic that an imperial aggressor does not bother to look into. To commemorate the crimes in Fallujah, the US Navy has just commissioned its newest assault vessel, naming it the USS Fallujah with an eloquent statement about the heroism of the Marines who carried out this noble effort. Well, such things are not reported in the US media, but it's a free country, so you can read about it in the margins if you can find them. You can also read the reaction of Iraqis who were not amused. Since we rarely hear the voices from below, it's worth quoting one. Quote, journalist Nabil Salih. He writes that, I'm quoting him now, the US savagery didn't end with a wholesale massacre of women and children and showering Fallujah in depleted uranium and white phosphorus. 20 years and incalculable birth defects later, the US Navy is naming one of its warships the USS Fallujah. This is how the US empire continues its war against Iraqis. Fallujah's name, bleached in white phosphorus, implanted in mothers' wombs for generations, is a spoil of war too. What is left is the haunting absence of family members, homes bombed into non-existence, photographs incinerated along with the smiling faces. Instead, a lethally corrupt system of cross-sectarian camaraderie and theft was bequeathed to us by the unpunished war criminals of Downing Street and the Beltway, the first great Western democracies. We might usefully recall an African proverb: until the lions have their own historians, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. Many examples. Why the difference in reaction in all these cases? It was explained simply by the great Indian novelist, activist Arundhati Roy. She was commenting on the reaction in India to the impassioned pronouncements in the West about Ukraine. Here's her words. Ukraine is certainly not seen here as something with a clear moral tale to tell. When brown or black people get bombed or shocked and awed, it doesn't matter. But with white people, it's supposed to be different. Well, reflecting on these matters, we learn some more about the likely prospects for the future. Again, the institutions, culture, have not materially changed, at least in high places, but the world most definitely is changing. Let's turn to that. One major change was brought about by Russia's criminal invasion of Ukraine. The invasion was also an act of criminal stupidity from Russia's point of view. The world is suffering from the invasion, primarily, of course, Ukraine, but well beyond. All apart from one exception, the US state corporate nexus. The war is a major reason for the huge growth of profits for fossil fuel, military-related industries. Military analysts are exulting publicly over the fact that for a fraction of the colossal US military budget, the military forces of Washington's main military adversary are being severely degraded. It's a bargain. More generally, Putin's aggression handed Washington a precious gift. Europe. Since World War II, a major concern of planners, as US planners, has been that Europe might become an independent force in world affairs, accommodating more closely with its natural partners in the East. Russia doesn't have much of an economy, but it's a very rich source of fuels and minerals including those needed for conversion to a renewable energy system. Its relation to Europe is complementary. It's a marriage made in heaven, as fine analyst Thomas Palley described it. And of course, the huge and growing China market lies right beyond. The threat arose early on in the Cold War with Charles de Gaulle's call for a Europe from the Atlantic to the Urals. Later in Willy Brandt's Ostpolitik, with the fall of the Soviet Union, and Gorbachev's vision of a common European home from Lisbon to Vladivostok, no military alliances, no victors and vanquished, common search for a social democratic future. Just in the last few days, these concerns in the US have been aroused again by Macron's diplomatic efforts with regard to China and Russia, disparaged here, of course, but not in the global South or even Europe. Haven't seen it reported here, but the head of the European Council, the former Belgian Prime Minister Charles Michel, last Tuesday said that European leaders are, quoting him, becoming increasingly favorable towards Macron's push for strategic autonomy away from the United States. He said that Macron's views reflect a growing shift among EU leaders. Well, that's not the story here, but it is the story. The establishment of NATO was one major counter to the threat of European independence. Same was true of the flat rejection of Stalin's and later Khrushchev's offers of détente. These are important matters, much too little discussed. Another was Clinton's violation of Bush #1's clear, unambiguous promise to Gorbachev that NATO would not expand to the east if Gorbachev agreed to allow Germany to be unified and to join NATO. That was not a small concession in the light of recent history. Well, Putin's aggression put an end to this threat, at least temporarily, though it's not at all clear how long Europe, with its highly sophisticated German-based industrial system, will be willing to face decline, as is now happening, by hanging on to Washington's coattails. Washington is exploiting the triumph. The last NATO summit a couple weeks ago, the United States extended NATO's reach to the Indo-Pacific region. That means enlisting Europe in Washington's confrontation with China, which has both military and economic dimensions. In the military dimension, official US policy, I'll quote it, is to encircle China with a ring of sentinel states, heavily armed with US supplied precision weapons aimed at China, backed with huge naval maneuvers in the Pacific. For the first time, nuclear-capable B-52s are being stationed in Guam, Northern Australia, within striking distance of China. US is also providing Australia with nuclear submarines to enhance the encirclement. Turn to the economic dimension. The Biden administration has virtually declared war on China. Business Press describes it that way accurately. Goal is to deprive China of the technology needed for its industrial growth. That would be a severe blow to the Netherlands, South Korea, Japan, where the world's most sophisticated industries are being ordered to abandon their major market. Whether they'll concede to the pressure, no one knows. So far, US corporations have found ways to get around the government pressure to shift production from China to Mexico, Vietnam, and India. Interesting study about it in the Asia Times. They report us quoting a strong correlation between these countries' imports from China and their exports to the United States, which means that US corporations maintain their China connections through intermediaries. Capital has its own ways. It's only under true fascism that business is subordinated to the state. Here it's most nearly the other way around, Stimson's principle. Well, meanwhile, China is continuing its vast development, diplomatic projects throughout Eurasia, reaching into Africa and the Middle East, even into Washington's backyard in Latin America. Guns don't stop it. The most recent surprise was the China-initiated accommodation between Iran and Saudi Arabia that throws a wrench into Washington's efforts to create an alliance of reactionary states to confront Iran. More deeply, throws a wrench into a core US policy going back to World War II to control the Middle East oil-producing regions, with Saudi Arabia the linchpin. That reminds us that there's a world outside the great powers, the global South, most of the world. It's been refusing to join the United States in what it sees as a proxy war between the US and Russia over Ukrainian bodies. India, Indonesia, Brazil, African countries have rejected US pressure to join in the sanctions against Russia. They're pursuing their own diplomatic, commercial relations with Russia and with China, much to Washington's displeasure. Well, these are only broad brushstrokes. I think the general picture is one of a fragmenting world with many uncertainties ahead and many threats. It's no secret that this is a unique moment in human history. Within the next few decades, we will decide whether the human experiment on Earth persists or collapses in inglorious failure. And that decision will have to be a common one. The existential threats we face have no borders. Either humanity will find a way to work together to confront and overcome them, or we will all fall over the precipice together. Thanks.
Diane, you're muted.
I'm muted.
Sorry, I just wanted to say thank you very, very much. We have some questions coming in, and I know Suzanne will read those. I just wanted to start off, though, with a question about your material specifically. You have outlined the history of US military domination, and you have painted in the prospect of it being a thing of the past as we bend toward other alliances dominating or other alliances having more power. The argument's being made that the US is internally self-combusting, that we have so much political strife that we are sort of imploding from within. We are so polarized. We also, as you pointed out, are transferring wealth away from the people. I don't know if you want to wade into this, but is there any way that we can assess the likelihood of the U.S. maintaining its primacy or going the way of other empires like the British Empire, the Roman Empire, and the Ottoman Empire in the next 20 years, which seems to be about what we've got. It wasn't something you confronted head on in your speech, and that may have been for good reason, but it occurred to me and I wanted to ask.
Well, actually, I briefly did mention it. I mentioned the highly successful class war conducted against the working class and the middle class in the last 40 years, actually giving the number, the Rand Corporation's number, $50 trillion of robbery of the lower 90% of the population handed over to the top 1%. This has left anger, resentment, contempt for institutions blowing up in many ways. The US, it's pretty bad over most of the world, but the US is extreme. The US had pretty weak social policies even before the Reagan assault. Now it's a complete disaster, getting worse. Medicaid is going to be soon taken away from many states with the end of the COVID supplement. That means enormous numbers of people are going to be facing just lack of any health care. It's already a tragedy in the United States. It's the only country in the world in which mortality is actually increasing. You don't find that anywhere. Mortality increasing, mostly among the white working class. Deaths of despair, the economists call them. Doesn't happen except in war, or pestilence. It's happening here in a time of prosperity, which is highly concentrated. The Republican Party, or what used to be a political party, is now totally dedicated, 100%, to service to private power, private wealth, corporate power. The Democrats back in the 70s abandoned whatever commitment they had to working people and the poor, became a party of basically affluent professionals, people like us. That leaves the general population with essentially no representation. There have been few efforts to make moves in the other, back to something like social democracy. G. Biden tried it, but he was quickly beaten back. Well, that's moving towards the kind of situation which scholars of imperial collapse have described as the situation that is a good predictor of internal collapse. Maybe here as well. Don't have to talk about the threats, they're very severe. You're all perfectly familiar with them, so I won't review them. But yes, to answer your question, I think the US may destroy itself from within. And in fact, a good bit of the world is observing that. In the case of enemy states with joy, and the case of others with despair.
I'm going to yield the floor over to Suzanne, who's been going through the Q&A, and we'll select some to read.
All right, I'm going to select here a question from Ken, who says, I understand that you are an anarchist, but is there a best or worst type of government? Which is a loaded question.
Sure. There are better and worse kinds of government and social order. In fact, since World War II, we've experienced two different ones. The first period was 50s and the 60s. It was a period when the New Deal social democratic policies still held plenty of flaws, but it was the greatest growth period in American history. It was egalitarian growth. The lowest quintile did about as well as the highest quintile. A lot of problems, a lot to criticize, but economists call it the golden age of American capitalism. In Europe, similar, it's France, it's called Le Trente Glorieuses, 30 glorious years. That was a period of what's called regimented capitalism, not savage capitalism, like the last 40 years. That was a big change. If you look back at the period, the United States was pretty much within the range of other societies by most measures. Health costs, incarceration, most social wages increased along with productivity. All of that began in the late 70s with Carter, but then took off like an avalanche with Reagan. There were no fiscal crises during the 50s and 60s, no collapses, because the Treasury Department controlled banks. There was no vast growth of financial institutions out of control. Neoliberalism is called rhetorically a free trade system, a free market system. That's a joke. It's not a free market system. It's a bailout economy, as economists have described it. So Reagan opened the floodgates for risky, first of all, for the enormous growth of financial institutions, then risky investments and so on. But they're safe. They lead to collapses, crashes. Friendly taxpayer moves in and bails out the perpetrators. It's been happening regularly ever since the early part of the Reagan years. Bailout of Continental Illinois, then savings and loan bailout, then Clinton high-tech bailout, then 2008, huge recession, enormous bailout for the perpetrators, not the victims. We're writing and seeing another one right now, in fact. Don't know how severe it'll get. But that's the game. Let people, the rich, make as much money as they like, risky investments, don't control it, tax cheating, anything you want. And if anything goes wrong, call on the taxpayer to bail them out. That's neoliberalism, it's class war. In the Netherlands too, in different ways, much of the world. Well, yes, so there are different systems. There's the regimented capitalism of the New Deal period and its aftermath. And there's the savage capitalism of the Reagan, Clinton, Obama years, Bush-Obama years. Of course, with Trump, it just became a joke.
I'm going to ask a quick follow-up question of my own to that. Do you think the global threat of climate change could be a counter to such recent regimented capitalism? Do you think that could bring the change where we're going to see more profits being used for the global good?
Well, there are ways to mitigate and control the environmental catastrophe. They're well known, spelled out in detail. Find them easily. They're feasible with a small percentage of GDP, maybe 3 or 4% of GDP, less than is used to bail out the financial institutions when they crash the economy. So it can be done. Not going to be done the way it is being done, not by the Stimson principle. If the principle is you got to make sure that business makes profit, no, you're not going to do it. We see this over and over. We see it right now in the Inflation Reduction Act. Just take a look at its provisions. Subsidies to business in the hope that maybe they'll be nice guys. Open new oil fields for federal lands, which they can exploit for decades, long after we're over the cliff. It's not going to work that way. We see it at the COP meetings. So take COP27 in Glasgow. It was quite interesting. The American delegate, John Kerry, was ecstatic. He said, now we're going to win. We have the market on our side. He said the asset managers like BlackRock have pledged tens of trillions of dollars to us to work for sustainable energy. How can we lose? Well, there was a small footnote that wasn't reported except by a couple of very good economists like Adam Tooze, pointed out that yes, BlackRock, Larry Fink, and others said we'll be happy to invest tens of trillions of dollars on two conditions. First condition is that the investments are profitable. Second condition is that if we get into any trouble, the IMF will bail us out. Stimson principle. Well, you can see how that's going to work. So to answer the question, yes, there are feasible means. No, they will not be implemented if we keep to the Stimson principle, the guiding principle of capitalist world order, in an extreme form under the savage capitalism of the past 40 years.
Right, right. It's a very good answer. And we're going to move this away a little bit, and also going back to the first time I got to know your work was when I was writing a thesis on the responsibility to protect, which is now, as you at the time already called it, a skeleton in the closet. We have a question here that sort of relates to that, that says, Professor Chomsky has eloquently made the case against the rules-based world order. Apart from the violation of Article 24 by US presidents, what is the affirmative case for a UN-based world order? Any efforts to obtain action from the Security Council has been met with a veto by Russia and abstention by some of the rotating members. In short, how can a UN-based world order protect our planet from state violence, war making, and existential threats like climate change?
Well, actually, the United States is the champion of vetoes at the UN Security Council. Blocks almost anything. It's even, US has even vetoed resolutions calling on all states to observe international law. No specific state was mentioned, but everybody knew what the meaning was. It was the US rejection of the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, condemnation of the United States for its terrorist war against Nicaragua, ordering the US to terminate the terrorism and pay substantial reparations. Of course, the US disregarded it. UN Security Council then voted that states should observe international law. US vetoed it. Veto after veto, long record. We don't talk about those. We only talk about Russian vetoes. That's part of the subordination to power. So what's the argument for a UN-based order? UN Charter is the best system around. If you can think of a better one, let's hear it. It's true that there are imperfections, like the ability of the United States primarily, Russia secondarily, to veto resolutions. Okay, that should be overcome. Be hard, but most of the world is calling for a reduction or mitigation of the Security Council vetoes by technically the 5 leading members, but primarily the United States, secondarily Russia. Now, there are measures through the General Assembly of getting around the Security Council veto, and they can be pursued to some extent, but not unless the great powers support them. The UN can act only insofar as the great powers support it. You look at the record, you'll find it overwhelmingly the United States that has blocked the UN from acting, case after case. In fact, the United States virtually never signs any of the implementing treaties, that conventions that would implement the decisions of the Charter, the UN, the UD, Universal Declaration of Human Rights. There's a long list of enabling measures which the US simply refuses to sign. It's alone on almost everything. Take the Genocide Convention. The United States finally signed it after 40 years, but with a reservation inapplicable to the United States. Actually, that came to the courts, to the International Tribunal on Yugoslavia, which, as you may know, Yugoslavia brought a case against NATO for the bombing of Clinton's initiated bombing of Serbia. All of the NATO powers agreed to be subject to the judgment of the tribunal, with one exception. The United States withdrew, and the court accepted the US reasons. Yugoslavia had mentioned the word genocide in the charges, and the United States is self-exempted from the charge of genocide. And so those are the court rules that allowed the United States to unilaterally withdraw. Same with the Torture Convention. US finally signed it, but with a reservation excluding the means of torture that are used by the CIA, which it picked up from the KGB. We can go on and on like this. But yes, there are flaws in the United Nations. Mainly the great powers, primarily the United States, have impeded the implementation of the policies that are available theoretically. Not that other countries are saintly, far from it, many of them awful, but this happens to be the record. And if there's a better system than the UN system, I'd be happy to hear about it. I might say a word about responsibility to protect. It's a very interesting idea. It was developed in the 1990s when a new excuse was needed for intervention. Before that, you could just say the Russians are coming, and everybody fell into line in the United States. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, you couldn't do that. So there's a major effort to discover new techniques of intervention. Humanitarian intervention was invented, responsibility to protect was invented. And it's a very interesting concept. There are two versions of it. There's an official version, which was passed by the General Assembly, 2005. It's pretty pallid. It simply says all states must observe the UN Charter, not allowed to use force or threat of force without Security Council authorization, but states should try to pressure countries that are carrying out human rights violations to stop carrying them out. It's anodyne. That's the official version. There's another version, the version of the Gareth Evans Commission. Evans was the Prime Minister of Australia. He had a separate commission, which I think was 2000, 2001, produced a version of responsibility to protect, which is the same as the one that was a couple of years later accepted by the UN, with one change. He said, regional powers have the right to intervene by force within the region of their jurisdiction, subject to later authorization by the Security Council. Well, which regional organization has the power to do that? One, NATO. That's the rule-based order. So the Evans version is the United States, which of course runs NATO, has the right to freely intervene claiming responsibility to protect, even without Security Council authorization? Well, you look at the literature and the record, you find that the United States and US scholars appeal to the UN version for authorization and legality, but they apply the Evans version. Take a look, it's consistent. That's the way great powers operate.
That seems to be a convenient place to wrap up. This hour flew by, and Professor Chomsky, I can't thank you enough. I hope you will come back.
Hope so.
And we do have a gift to thank you for coming. This book, which I'm sure you already have, will be donated to the New York Public Library in your name. It is, of course,
Thank you. That's a
by
wonderful gift.
Professor Howard Zinn's history. It's known as the People's History of the United States, and this is the updated version called the 20th Century. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you everyone for coming, and we hope we can continue this at another date.
Hope so. Would be very much good to be
Goodbye,
with you.
everyone.
Thanks very much.